Greetings, art enthusiasts, and this is Warren Edwards, and you are here with Create Matter. And we are here at the Art Science Complex with Julie Rower and Bruce Gemmell. And we're here at the library where we have over 5,000 books, and it's filled with information from all your wildest fantasies. So here we are, and we're going to have a brief and very concise conversation with the co-founders of this complex.
Thank you. Yes, we would like to welcome the viewer inside the realms of our work as if they're on a micro scale, inhabiting Bruce's models, our drawings, and my paintings.
Yes, hello, this is Warren Edwards, and this is Create Matter. And I am with our esteemed guest, Bruce Gemmell. Okay, so I wanted to start this off by asking you, tell us a little bit about your creative process and what inspired you to want to showcase such a great, fascinating array of art.
It starts when I'm a little boy, and I was telling before the story about in Queens Village, there was a Queens Village Public Library, and I was brought to a reading group. And there was this beautiful woman, Mrs. Rosen, and she was the librarian. And she saw that Bruce wasn't the kid who kind of sits in the group. And I gravitated towards the shelves. The shelves were like this forest of ideas. So, trees have leaves, but libraries have books, concepts, ideas. So for me, I went into that forest of ideas, and I never came out. So anyway, one of the first books I came across was this big book with this kind of leather color, and I didn't know who Leonardo da Vinci was. But that's where, to answer your question in a roundabout way, that's where it started. I opened up this book, and I saw drawings, diagrams, everything in the world was taken apart, and he tried to understand it. So I thought, I want to do that. That's so cool. So that's been my explanation. So I realized that all I've ever tried to do was understand things. So I remember all I wanted to do was get notebooks like Leonardo. I was like, Mom, I want to get notebooks like Leonardo. I was like, no, you don't go to school. Anyway, that's another story. But the point was, I just wanted to figure things out. And then take those things that I discovered and kind of say, hey, what could this be used for? What could that be used for? So my process was just the activity of my body finding things. So if I find something in a book, if I find something in a page, I was just looking at the book, and like Robert has these beautiful images. And I started seeing that some of the patterns on these indigenous clothes are some of the same patterns I have right here. And I realized nature comes back to these things because they're useful. So I realized this pattern has a use, but in different combinations it can do different things. In DNA, in plants, in clothings, in patterns, and in some of the things, I call these ribbons. So I'm doing these series of like what I call ribbon structures. I'm kind of stacking them. There's a couple of them. One of them is like this one right here. This is basically connected. Now what I decided was architectural models are usually put together and they're glued together and they're static. But what I did was I made something where I decided how to make this where the pieces aren't glued together. These are all just held together. So you can see I can kind of move this. This is more the way that things actually work. Bodies work this way. Buildings work this way. I came up with, I believe that there was an American impulse towards an organic architecture that got subverted in our country. And all these ideas of sustainability and green and all these things, they really are the aftershocks of that loss of that idea of an organic architecture. Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, Bruce Goff, they understood the relationship of the house to the ground, the individual to the house. So, I remember giving a talk, I think it was the University of Texas in Austin, where I talked about the idea that in my lifetime I expect to grow a building rather than build it. So I'm still working on those ideas. So now I see buildings almost like seeds that you plant in the ground. And you think about Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, they were built into the ground. He didn't plant them, but they had that vestigial idea of almost like a prosthetic seed. But what about an actual seed? A seed that actually can flower and we can inhabit it So we don't have this artificial separation from city to country, right? So that in the indigenous relationship, we build out of the materials we have, like a termite. A termite basically takes the things that he has and he uses his body and his processes, and he builds greater than we do as humans.
So, tell us about architecturally provocative artifacts.
An architecturally provocative artifact is something that I find that I believe can be useful and can combined with other artifacts. Sometimes what happens is you kind of have things that can be, like I was speaking of before, I mean, I'll look at things and I'll say, what could this conceivably be? Now, I used to think about this in a kind of static shape, but now I realize these things are actually real. And I can kind of combine these things into different kind of configurations. I mean, like I said, some of these things, you know, kind of can be put together in ways that become useful. So the idea is trying to find useful combinations of things. What this model here that I'm working on, this piece will be put in here, and as a result of it moving along this slot, this will be, I'm figuring out this plane right now. In the process of doing that, this will be able to be open and closed. So if I did, I could close this all and make this shape. And then if I wanted to do that, I could extend it and then make these into rooms. But the point is, you know, these things are just configurations, but they have a purpose. So the idea is, people say a lot of times in architecture, form follows function, function follows form. I find the intrigue is to find the usefulness in the configuration. That's what makes an artifact provocative, is it challenges what we think we know.
Okay. So I was going through some of the things that you said through, I was looking at the website, and I came across something I read, and I wanted to know, what was your fascination with the dragonfly?
The dragonfly for me is this story that comes from when I was in first grade. I loved Leonardo, like I said, and Leonardo wanted to do a flying machine. So the flying machine was always a bird model. Now I remember one day it was when I got my notebooks, and I took my notebook out to the playground, and in the process, you know, I'm running around having fun, and like, I made a new friend. I met a dragonfly. So I'm running, doing my thing, and the dragonfly is doing his thing, and we go like this. We almost hit each other, and like at a certain moment, we're like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, and I'm here, and the dragonfly is here, and we communicated. He's like, he looks at me and he's like, "Kid, I almost ran into you," and I'm like, "I'm sorry, sir." So now I'm watching this dragonfly. This dragonfly goes like this and goes like that, and I'm like, Leonardo had it wrong. A bird can fly pretty well, but not like a dragonfly. And I'm like, wow, this thing can go backwards, and it can go vertical, it can turn itself. And I'm like, and I was like, wow, I just realized, if I'm going to make my flying machine, again, I'm like 6, 7 years old, right? It's got to be a dragonfly. So the dragonfly has always been for me. Now, again, I haven't made it yet. It hasn't happened yet. But for me, the dragonfly has always symbolized for me that simplicity and elegance of flight like no other.
I have another question for you. So, what have you learned from the woefully inaccurate?
What have I learned from?
The woefully inaccurate.
The woefully inaccurate. I'd say woefully inaccurate is an interesting term. It gives you the opportunity to find what you have and what it can be turned into. I think what happens a lot of times is we see things in a very static way, that is a completely contained thing. But the woefully inadequate is basically usually misunderstood. It's misunderstood because we don't see that instead of one thing, which is our kind of lens, it's usually a complex conglomeration of fragments. And sometimes when you kind of take the pieces apart and you're like, you realize it's like, oh, I just had them put together wrong. I was trying to look at it from the wrong perspective. I've always felt that one of the great things about drawing is Drawing means you have to constantly find that point of view that gives you a compelling image. So the thing is, the woefully inadequate is that thing that basically is yet to be understood. But there's a reason why you're drawn to it, or you wouldn't spend time with it. So the thing is, if you look at the woefully inadequate, you're like, okay, there's something here. Can I find it? And it's those things that people do when they find those things that kind of like start to illustrate genius.
Okay. What do you think about the symbology in numbers?
The symbology in numbers.
Yes.
You know, I believe that numbers have the most fascinating capacities. Some of the things they do are give us access to patterns. Sometimes they kind of give us kind of symbolizations in terms of the fact that you say, oh, wait a minute. There's a certain significance to these numbers that separate them from other numbers. They have families, they have tribes. Prime numbers are a good example. A prime number is my number and the number 1, which almost exemplifies the singularity of that. But they become symbolic of the fact that these things start to become associated with certain things, certain rituals, certain tribes, certain things, certain activities. I believe my 2 favorite numbers that also become kind of symbols, because they're my favorite shapes, are the equilateral triangle and the hexagon, because they play well with each other. And that's 3 and 6. 6 is carbon. Carbon is where we get amino acids. Amino acids create proteins. They create all life. So 6 is very important. 3 sixes is the devil. But 6 is creation. So the capacity of numbers to kind of fire our imagination, we create the symbols because we see the significance in our investigations. And we're like, 4? Oh, 4 is a square. 3 is good because if I have an equilateral triangle, I have a stable form.
I wanted to say something about the number 3. I did a little bit of research and study on the number 3 itself, and I always wonder what makes 3 the magic number. What gives it that special thing that people say about the number 3? And I thought about it. I said, it's the number that reached infinitude. The first number to reach infinitude, to have that 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, to keep on going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and I wonder, but then is that little piece, that sacrifice.
There's always left.
That little
Right,
sacrifice.
right.
There you go. You see, it's like, that sacrifice, it had to give off so we can have that longevity, so we can have that span.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting.
It is. And in fact, what happens is when we understand real numbers and we understand, like, kind of the fact that, like, there are these numbers that repeat, like pi, and oil is constant and these other numbers, you realize they go on infinitely. But we realize they're numbers. It's not like 3. We think of a number, oh, what's a number? 3, 6. But 3.1415 ... is a number, which is a number that, like, we need to understand because it actually helps us understand circles, right? And without, we found these things by accident. We realized, like, okay, if I want to find out the relationship between this piece to this piece, I'm always left with this crazy number that kind of leaves this piece. It's like, and it was like, oh, we call it pi. Where'd it come from? It's like, it was there. So now a lot of times I talk to my friends who are mathematicians, and it's like, did we discover that, or did we invent that? And that's a kind of question that I love. Is like, did we invent mathematics, or did we discover mathematics? And there's a discussion about that. I love that discussion. It's like, well, pi was there. We found it. But, like, did we find it because we were doing something? If we hadn't played with the circle and we felt the circle, we don't see circles in nature, but we imagined a circle as a useful thing because we wanted to lay out land. Because, I mean, you think about the fact, like, oh, this is my, okay, look, this is my land, and it's like, this is the line. You stay over there, and I'll stay over here. And then we found that regular and irregular things that happened in the terrain, we had to come up with curves and shapes. And then we were like, oh, wow, we discovered all these funny things about numbers because we started looking into, like, just how to separate us from each other. Which is good because, it's good that, like, you want to go over here and you want to play your music and it's really loud. And I want to go over here and play my music and it's really loud. You don't like my music, I don't like yours, but we can all get along. It's like, look, it's like, and then the people who like both our music, they can kind of stand in the middle on the border, like, okay, I don't like this piece, but I like this piece. And then they'll kind of move back and forth. And then we start to organize ourselves. So these things actually bring us to have to start.
Sort of like molecular bonding.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly. And I mean, the thing is, and these things, a lot of times we think about these things like we discovered them or we created them, but they happen in nature all the time. I mean, all these things that happen, accretion is something that just basically happens, And I mean, one of the things that we talk about is the operation of the metaphor. And the operation of the metaphor is something we understand through, we understand like, the ship, a simile is a ship plows the sea, or we say like, the cypress is the ghost of a dead flame. So we understand this combination of concepts to create new concepts. But the reality is, we didn't invent the metaphorical operation. It happens in nature. Because organisms basically kind of like can actually digest other organisms and basically create new organisms. And the thing is, things branch off. But even in some of the, in fact, I wrote let's see, what's her name? Lynn Margulis, brilliant kind of biologist. She talked about the fact that some of the beginning organisms basically are formed by the fact that out of some kind of desperation, they manage to kind of partially digest organisms that then transform them. Our mitochondria that are in our cells were originally part of another, they were part of their own, they were their own life form. And then they traded some of their DNA with ours to basically become part of the cell. I mean, and these kind of things happen. These kind of things mold and they create new things. The complexity of life always seems to move towards greater complexity.
This has been fascinating. And this is only part one of the series here at the Art Science Complex. So we're going to take a little quick break and we're going to talk to the other co-founder of this great establishment, Julie Rauer.